For thousands of years, humans have constantly colonized and inhabited whatever place they could find. We've already dominated all 7 continents, including Antarctica to some very true extent. And it's only natural and logical for us to now move on to our closest celestial neighbor, the Moon. Now, before starting the subject of lunar colonization, it's probably appropriate to just point out who exactly would own the Moon in such a case. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which is the most advanced document on space law, says that no country or nation may own the Moon as an actual object. But the document never says anything about private corporations or entities trying to lay claim over the Moon. So that means that technically, if a company wanted to, it could try to develop infrastructure and base it on the Moon and indeed claim ownership of parts of it. I actually did a video of this quite a while back, which is now probably quite outdated, that talks about people who have claimed to own the Moon in the past but have failed. But with the newly successful, yet sadly unreported Artemis mission, this seems like a very true possibility in the near future. And with them due to make actual crewed landings soon, I think it's a very important subject to talk about. Now most of our long-term plans rest on ISRU, in situ resource utilization. And it means that we would basically take whatever resources that we can find on the lunar surface and convert it into energy. Just for a very basic and oversimplified example, we can take, for example, ice, which is just water, and separate the oxygen and hydrogen into rocket fuel, and then use the oxygen to make a habitable atmosphere for the astronauts. That could work, and it's been proposed to work, and there are ongoing technologies at NASA and at various places to investigate how we could use this. So in terms of actually sustaining such a model, it's very possible. And theoretically speaking, if we had enough resources to start a base on the Moon, and we would use ISRU, we could very well sustain astronauts indefinitely if we had enough ice, which there is plenty on the Moon. And with constant resupplying missions, such a thing should be very possible and sustainable. So we should probably compare this to the more long-term goal of colonizing Mars. Now Mars, on the other hand, has an actual atmosphere, and unlike the Moon, which does kind of have a very thin atmosphere. We usually don't report it that way because we like to say that for this very, very simplified, almost memeified version of the Moon that says that it has no atmosphere and it's just like this rock in space. But it's not entirely true. It does have a very thin atmosphere, or at least remnants of atmosphere, which is just the Earth's geocorona, which is like the outermost layer of the Earth's atmosphere, and to some very small extent it does influence the Moon. And this will get especially relevant in terms of talking about how communication would work on a potential lunar colony. Because if we have, say, a colony on the dark side of the Moon, which does not face the Earth because the Moon is tightly boxed, it would mean that we would need to use relay stations that orbit the Moon, and we would use that to communicate messages back to Earth. But for such a thing to work, we would have to make sure that the relay stations or any kind of orbital station of the Moon won't decay in orbit. And such a thing is hard, because it is a very steady phenomenon that small changes, even well above the Kármán line, by the way. I mean, we have launched things that are like 200, 300 kilometers above the Earth's surface, orbiting at orbital speed. But eventually these orbits decay, and that's because there are very small remnants of Earth's atmosphere up there, and eventually the speed required to maintain the orbit drops below the Kármán line, and air resistance eventually works, and friction slows them down, and they end up disintegrating into Earth's atmosphere. On the Moon, something very similar happens in terms of orbital decay. There are these things called mass concentrations on the lunar surface. We creatively call them mascots. And if something orbits the Moon, sometimes it will cause a very aggressive gravitational pull, which would change the orbital path. Maybe it'll turn more ecliptic, or just completely have a very dangerous periapsis for that orbit, which would eventually cause collision with the lunar terrain. Most notably, this happened this happened to many different lunar craft, but most notably it happened to the lunar ascent stage of the Apollo missions. So when they were doing the Apollo missions, after the lunar ascent stage got the crew back to the part that would actually re-enter Earth and return safely, they detached or undocked the lunar ascent module, which then orbited the Moon for some time before eventually crashing into the terrain. Now that should seem impossible if you just take the Moon as just a very simple sphere or a very simple celestial object, like the Earth, for example. If the Earth had no atmosphere whatsoever, then something in orbit of it would basically orbit indefinitely. I mean, just like the Moon did, or the Moon or the Earth did for the Sun for billions of years, right? But unfortunately, with the Moon, it's different, because just like Bennu, the Moon is very small, and so it tends to be not spherical. Only celestial objects of a certain size tend to use gravity to push the objects towards the center, which causes this kind of spherical shape. So because of mascots, that would cause a very irregular orbit, and eventually the Lunar Ascent module did crash into the Moon. So that means that any kind of orbital station or orbital maneuvering for the Moon would require constant resupply missions. And because it would require constant resupply missions, it means that it would not actually be 100% sustainable. We would need to launch rockets constantly to the Moon and back if we are to maintain constant communication across the surface. Or maybe it could work the other way. Maybe the colonies on the lunar surface could talk to each other somehow without using radio stations. I don't really know at this point, but these are all options that we should definitely explore in the future. So theoretically speaking, if we were ambitious enough as a species to do something like this, it would very well be possible. Even the prior Apollo missions only worked because we were ambitious enough, and of course it was motivated by humanly earthling greed to demonstrate our superiority over other countries, which is basically why that happened. But it proves that if humans have the ambition to do something, they generally can do it. So I will be looking forward towards being at least some part of the lunar colonization efforts in the future, and I'll probably try to talk about the subject more. This episode here is going to be one of many videos where I just talk about the future, the current state of science, astronomy, space, technology and engineering over the kind of podcasts over basically every day, basically, right? So I'll try to every one day of the week, not every single day, but every week essentially. So I hope you enjoy this video, and I'll definitely try to talk more in the future. Thank you.